President Rob Allaire sat in a comfortable red and white upholstered club chair. His worn LL Bean boots were untied and propped up on a wood coffee table. Allaire wore jeans and a faded long-sleeve, red Lacoste rugby shirt. His longish brown hair was slightly messed up, and there was stubble across his chin. To his right, Allaire's yellow lab, Ranger, lay sleeping. Another dog, an old English bulldog named Mabel, was napping by the fireplace, the sound of her snoring occasionally making Allaire look up. To most Americans, the sight of the slightly unkempt President of the United States might have been off-putting, perhaps even a little shocking. If Allaire looked as if he hadn't taken a shower in 2 days and had worn the same pants an entire weekend, during which he chopped half a cord of wood, hiked 10 miles, and shot ski twice, it was because he had done just that. However, most Americans would have been pleased to see their president in his element, with his unadorned love of the outdoors, his simple joy in physical labor, his affection for his dogs. And now, at 5:15 in the afternoon on a windswept, rainy Saturday afternoon in April, his satisfaction at the sight of a bottle of beer, Budweiser to be exact, which one of Camp David's servants brought him as he sat staring into the fireplace. "Thanks, Rico," said Allaire. "You're welcome, Mr. President." In President Allaire's 6 years in office, he'd been to Camp David 122 times. Allaire would not, by his term's end, set any records in terms of time spent at the presidential retreat. That record would still belong to Ronald Reagan, who visited Camp David 186 times during his 2 terms in office. Still, Allaire loved Camp David just as much as Reagan, both Bushes, and every other president since Franklin Roosevelt had the retreat built almost a century before. Allaire loved its rustic simplicity, the quiet solitude, and he loved most the fact that Camp David allowed him to escape the backbiting, lying, sycophancy, and subterfuge of Washington. If Allaire was compared to Reagan for his constant escaping to Camp David, and for his conservative politics, that was okay by him. Allaire believed it was important to have a set of beliefs and to stick by them, through hell or high water, no matter what the polls or the prevailing wisdom said. It's why America loved Rob Allaire. Allaire sipped his beer as he stared down at the iPad, leaning closer to try and see, adjusting his glasses. He looked up. Seated on the far side of the room reading a book was John Schmidt, his communications director. "I can't read this goddamn thing," said Allaire. "You're the one who said you wanted one," said Schmidt. "Remember? It's the future and all that." "Yeah, well, I changed my mind. I'm sick of pretending I like these fucking things." Schmidt nodded. "We'll go back to the Daily Notebook, sir." "Good. In the meantime, have you read this editorial by our friends at the New York Times? How the hell is the New York Times editorial board aware of what's happening in Geneva?" "It's coming out of the Swiss Foreign Ministry," said Schmidt. "They're taking the credit, which is not necessarily a bad thing. To the extent it adds to the public pressure on Tehran, it's helpful." There was a knock on the door, and in stepped 2 men, Hector Calabrese, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Tim Lindsay, the U.S. Secretary of State. Calabrese and Lindsay, who'd been out shooting at the camp's private skeet range, were both dressed in shooting attire. Calabrese was an expert shot. He came up through the ranks of the CIA paramilitary and was deft with most weapons known to man. Lindsay, a retired former admiral in the Navy and lifelong hunter, was even better. "Well, if it isn't Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid," said Allaire, a shit-eating grin on his face as he watched the 2 men stomp their boots on the welcome mat and remove their Filson coats. "Either of you managed to hit anything?" "No, Mr. President," Calabrese said politely. "We thought it would be impolite to hit more clays than you." Allaire laughed. "Wise guy," said Allaire as Rico returned to the sitting area near the fireplace. "Do you 2 have time for a drink before you leave for D.C.? "Sure," said Calabrese. "Same thing as the president, Rico." "Pappy Van Winkle," said Lindsay, looking at Rico. "If there's any left, a couple of rocks. Thanks, Rico." "Yes, sir," said the bespectacled servant, who turned and left for the kitchen. "Seriously," continued Allaire, "who won?" "It's not a contest," said Calabrese, his confident smile leaving little doubt as to who hit more clays that afternoon. He moved to one of the sofas and sat down. "I'm 64 years old, for Christ's sakes," said Lindsay, sitting across from Calabrese next to Schmidt. "I'm surprised I hit anything." "I've heard that one before," said Allaire, taking a sip from his beer and shaking his head at Lindsay. "Right before you took $20 off me." "That was a lucky day, Mr. President," said Lindsay as Rico brought a tray with drinks on it. The four men sat talking about skeet shooting and hunting for a long time, the president regaling the others with a story about the time as governor of California when he'd gone dove hunting with then Vice President Cheney just a few months after Cheney had strafed someone with an errant shot. The story, as with most of Allaire's elaborate and expertly told stories, left the other three in laughter. Allaire stood and put more wood on the fire, played with the arrangement of the logs for a time, then returned to his chair. "Before we take off, Mr. President," said Lindsay, "we need to discuss the proposal by the Swiss foreign minister." "We've already discussed it," said Allaire. "I gave you my answer 2 days ago, Tim. I refuse to sit down with the president of Iran. It's that simple. Ambassador Veeder believes that if we agree to a summit, with you and President Nava meeting one-on-one, that the Iranians will renounce their nuclear ambitions and might even agree to begin talks with the Israelis. I trust Iran about as far as I can throw them," said Allaire. "They're lying. I've seen this movie before, Tim. I don't like the ending."